What's going on, everyone? Desktops Gaming here. Welcome back to the channel. And by the looks of things, you might think we might be doing a build today, but actually doing something a little different. We're going to be going over some PC building mistakes, more so before you would even start a build. So we're going to be going over a couple different component choices and why you might substitute things here and there. And like I said, this is not going to be an all-encompassing list. We would be here for hours, if not days, to cover every possible thing. So if you do have anything you think of that I didn't touch on in this video, just drop a comment down below. This is more so geared towards maybe new builders coming into this year wanting to set up their own build. Granted, they can find graphics cards, but like I said, I want to touch over maybe a few choices and mistakes new builders might make on a couple different components. So like I said, yeah, if you do have any other suggestions, drop a comment down below and then subscribe while you're down there. I'd appreciate that very much. And then just up front in the video, I do apologize for the AC fan sound there. It is very hot currently where I live. I live in the southern part of the United States. It gets pretty warm here and going into the spring and summer. So again, apologize for that, but I didn't want to be here sweating. So like I said, that's going to be on probably throughout the video. So I can apologize up front for that. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into everything we're going to cover today. All right, so like I said in the intro, there's plenty of components laid out here, kind of everything you would need to put into a build. Like I said, but I was going to go over, some changes you might make out, and then, just some common mistakes that someone might make when doing a build. So let's start with the kind of the brains of the operation here, the motherboard itself. These motherboards come in all different shapes and sizes, like I said, so depending on what kind of build you're going for. Just to give some basics, again, this is geared more towards someone just getting into PC building. Motherboards come in a couple different form factors. Probably the most popular and most common one being ATX. This is a full-size ATX here. Like I said, they are about yay big, typically have more PCIe expansion slots, as well as M.2 slots in some of the boards. And these fit a standard ATX case as well. This is the most common form factor you might run across, but there are others out there, such as micro ATX, which is going to be a little bit smaller than this one, and then mini ITX is the other common one as well for very small form factor builds. Like I said, so for the majority of customers out there and PC builder enthusiasts, unless you're into small form factor stuff or want something with a smaller footprint, like I said, the ATX size, which you're going to be going with. Now, when it comes to motherboards, whether it be AMD or Intel, depending on what CPU you're going to go with, they do come in a couple of different flavors, we'll call them. So like I said, currently on the AMD side with Ryzen 5000 series processors, you have two main chipsets. The chipset is what is at the kind of bottom side of the motherboard here. This is what is kind of controlling a lot of input-output devices of what your CPU is not handling. Because not to dive in too heavy here, because like I said, this is kind of geared towards newer people, but basically your CPU will handle a lot of the talking going on the motherboard, and it passes off the rest of it to the chipset. There's currently two main different ones on the AMD side. You have, for AM4 sockets like this, you pretty much have X570 and current B550 as far as the most current boards out and chipsets out that'll fit the newest generation of processors. Now you can go back because AMD is decently backwards compatible, but those are the two most current generations. So what are you getting between those two? Or what mistakes might you make when you decide to try to look at different motherboard options out there, whether you choose B550 or X570? Because both have, both are going to be to run the newest gen processors just fine. Both are going to be able to handle Ryzen 5000 series. Granted, they're updated, but the biggest difference between the two, and where you could even save some money depending on the board, is typically with X570s like this one. Both M.2 slots here, these lanes here, are actually geared to run PCIe Gen 4. So what does that mean? The main reason, like I said, the PCIe slots here will run Gen 4. That's not currently needed on most modern graphics cards right now. Like I said, AMD and Intel and NVIDIA have kind of implemented their resizable bar or smart support for those to run into a little bit of a performance increase in certain games, but the biggest benefit you'll see on PCIe Gen 4 is actually on M.2 speed. So what that means is you have the option with these guys to put a Gen 4 M.2 or storage device that attaches to the motherboard, and that gives you the option to increase your read and write speeds, meaning how fast you can pull data and save data to that drive. Now, for most gamers out there, that's not really needed. Like I said, you typically only run into issues like that if you're needing something like that, if you're going to be, constantly moving data back and forth, reading and writing, saving data back and forth, to say more so helpful for someone that's going to do a lot of heavy content creation, or they're moving a lot of data back and forth, bigger files, things of that nature. PCIe Gen 3 is still fine for every graphics card that's out, whether it be 20 series or 30 series on the Nvidia side, and even the newer AMD GPUs. Like I said, and it's PCIe Gen 3 Nvme drives are fine as far as storage, because they're still going to be a lot faster than your typical SATA drive, as well as not really seeing that big of a performance increase in games or anything like that as far as load times or anything like that. PCIe Gen 3 M.2s like this one I have installed, this XPG one I have installed, and this motherboard now is going to handle everything just fine. Like I said, that's where you can run into some cost savings too, as well. Because like I said, on X570 like this, both of these slots here can handle Gen 4 speeds. Whereas on B550 motherboards, only the slot closest to the CPU is going to be running at that Gen 4 speed, whereas any other M.2 slot and other PCIe lanes on the motherboard are going to be to Gen 3. So typically, X570s are going to be a little more depending on which model you look at. I've looked at some higher end B550 kind of tied in pretty close with some lower end X570 motherboards, but typically the highest X570 is going to be a little outpriced compared to the highest end B550. And then going into Intel, I don't have an Intel board to show, but like I said, they are now with their current 11th generation or 11th generation series processors, they've enabled Gen 4 support on their motherboards now as well. And then Intel has two sides of that as well. There's Z series and B series motherboards. Their Z series being the ones that can support that Gen 4 support. So really, when it comes to selecting your storage, you're only really going to gain an added benefit if we are, if you're doing some kind of content creation where you're moving files that are decently large and would take time back and forth, or need access to that data faster. That's really the only time you're going to see a benefit in going with Gen 4. They're really cool. They're really fast, but as far as just, you want to play games, as far as downloading, updating, having more capacity is definitely more needed these days, especially since games have kind of pushed over to, some up to 200 gigs for one game. You need more so capacity than, just raw speed at that point. But I found in most testing, and you can look at different benchmarks out there, definitely I'd recommend that. Look around and see if you notice a difference in certain games. But for most games, PCIe Gen 3 is just fine. I will say I do like, when it comes to storage, since we're talking about that, I do like the advent of Nvme drives, these PCIe drives like this, because they're easier to deal with. Like I said, they attach straight to the motherboards. That means no power or SATA cables to run. That's definitely an added bonus as far as cleaning up the inside of your case. So there's less wires to run. They're faster than, like I said, your typical SATA 6 drive. But like I said, and they're getting even cheaper. And like I said, PCIe Gen 3 is just fast enough. As far as CPUs go, let's talk in this instance of the one I have in here, which is the Ryzen 5 3600. It's the previous generation, mid-tier, kind of $200 or so price range CPU. Biggest thing people talk about when it comes to CPUs, outside of just, how they perform in clock speeds, is how to cool them. So that'll segue us into the two coolers I have laid out on the table here. When it comes to cooling your CPU, there's a couple different things you can look at. You definitely want to support the socket, obviously. But the biggest thing is, well, how good is it going to cool my CPU? So definitely when it comes to a lower TDP part like this Ryzen 5 3600 here, you don't really need a crazy amount of cooling. Like I said, it's only a 65 watt TDP part, so it's not going to generate a ton of heat even once you get into overclocking. So when it comes to that, you don't have to go with the biggest and baddest AIO out there. Like I said, this is a Castle 360EX from Deepcool. They do look awesome. I will say I do love Deepcool stuff. But like I said, this is a little overkill for, say, something like this 3600 here, or even my 5600X that I have in my main rig over there. While it will bring the temps a little cooler typically than a lot of smaller air coolers, you can get them run a little quieter since you do have 3 fans on something like a 360 rad or a 240 rad. You can get your temperatures lower, it's still a little overkill and say money you could spend somewhere else when it comes to cooling your CPU. Say something like this Deepcool AS500 here. It can get pretty close to what that Castle 360EX can do. It's a single 140 fan here, so less you have to worry about fans dying, because since you just have one here, less you have to worry about any potential failures of the pumps later down the line. You know, the liquid in the tubing, you know, kind of permeating the tubes on the AIO itself. That's going to happen over time. Like I said, air coolers do wear out over time as well, but typically you have less points of failure on an air cooler like this, and especially when it comes to a part like this, if you don't want to run the stock cooler, because a lot of CPUs either aren't coming with them, especially once you get to the higher end coolers, and you want something that's going to run a little quieter, this guy will still run a lot quieter than, say, a stock cooler would, give you ample cooling performance and even some overclocking headroom. Now, like I said, when you start getting into the higher end CPUs, so say, you know, in this instance, we wanted to throw a 5950X in here, a 5900X in here, yeah, that's when I would recommend maybe stepping up to something that's going to cool a little better. While this would handle even, say, a 5900X just fine, you know, taking up to the higher overclocking range of what that chip is capable of, you're going to have more thermal headroom when it comes to something like that Deepcool 360 over there. While it's not necessarily needed all the time, you know, like I said, a standard cooler like that will keep the CPU in check. You definitely do gain more headroom and even lower noise levels typically, since you wouldn't have to run one fan quite as high to maintain what 3 fans could, say, on a radiator like that. So let's get into RAM, since we're talking about stuff that goes on the motherboard. RAM also comes in different shapes and sizes and different speeds. So when it comes to RAM installing into your motherboard, if you're looking at most standard ATX motherboards, you're going to have 4 DIMMs or 4 slots that RAM can plug into. Now, definitely always check your motherboard, say they might decide to change it down the line, but if you're only going to install 2, which I do recommend, by the way, dual channel memory, whether it be on Intel or AMD, meaning you have 2 separate sticks, definitely works better and you have less latency when it comes to how it talks to your CPU. On most motherboards on the market now, A2 and, or just to make sure here, yeah, the A2 and B2 are definitely the first slots you want to populate. Again, always check your motherboard manual to make sure that's the case, but it's typically the second one away from the CPU and the 4th one away from the CPU is where you're going to install, say if you just have 2 sticks. Now getting into more over of what, you know, you can get out of RAM, especially when it comes to AMD-based systems. Gaming performance-wise, you do gain some better performance off of going with RAM that has a higher clock speed or higher megahertz it can run on. You know, as far as these 2 sticks here, these are 2 sticks of G.Skill Trident Z at 3600 megahertz, which is kind of the sweet spot, I would say, for most AMD-based systems, especially the newest generation 5000 series stuff. And so with Intel now, like I said, memory compatibility is catching up on both platforms. So typically, I'd recommend going between 3200 and 3600 megahertz on your RAM. And I hate the word future-proof, but to give yourself a little more room, I would recommend going with 16 gigs or 2 8-gig sticks, like you see here. Much more than that, as far as just gaming, is a little harder to justify. But if you're going to be doing some light content creation, something that can handle or something that can utilize higher, RAM as far as capacity goes, you could go up to, say, a 32 gig kit. I do use one in my current setup, a 32 gig kit, but for gaming, most of the time, 16 gigs will get you by just fine, and I don't see that changing, at least in the next 2 years or so. But like I said, just, you want to kind of shoot for that around 3200 to 3600 megahertz. Just a pro tip, real quick, as far as when you're shopping around for different motherboards, as far as, the different features you want when it comes to how many M.2 slots does it have, how many fan, connectors does it have, how many RGB connectors does it have, and we'll circle back to that here in just a little bit. You can always go into the motherboard vendor site and check the qualified vendor list. So say if you're looking at, say, a set of G.Skill Trident Z RAM here, which these kits are pretty compatible with just about any motherboard I've run, but say, you're getting a different kit than this, you can always go onto the manufacturer's website. So say in this case, we'd go onto Gigabyte site here, pull up the qualified vendor list or QVL list for the X570 Aorus Elite here. And then you can actually look down of all the RAM that is compatible with this board. Now sometimes it'll be off that list and it'll still end up working, but if you want to be sure, you can always check that list because the vendors will go through and test different memory kits on their motherboards and see which ones are working straight out of the box. While we're on RAM, with motherboards in particular, what I've seen some newer builders do, or even some in pre-builts now that get shipped to people that say they buy a pre-built that's already built for them, is they'll have some decently speed RAM in there, whether it be 3200 or 3600 megahertz kits. They're installed, maybe even 2 of them in there, hopefully, even though it's a big thing with pre-built, only to include 1, say, or higher capacity stick. Like I said, but they won't go in and actually enable the XMP or DOCP settings. Now what those are is, say on this RAM kit, again, we were talking about this G-Skill Trident Z kit, this is a 3600 megahertz kit with let's see, what's the CAS on these? CAS latency is 18, 22, 22, 42. So decently tight timings for a kit this size at 3600 megahertz. This kit will run at 3600. And these are at 3600 megahertz. Like I said, so these, you want to definitely make sure you're getting all the speed you're paying for if you're going with a kit that is this capacity. So what you need to do is go into your BIOS, which when you're booting a computer, typically you just kind of want to smash the delete key until you go into BIOS. You'll see a section there for as far as Intel boards go, that'll called XMP or Extreme Memory Profile, and it'll have typically the Extreme Memory Profile that's printed on the RAM itself. And then for AMD systems, they call it something a little different. It's typically under DOCP settings, and it's but it's the same idea. It'll have the kind of profile that is printed on the sticker of the RAM here that the motherboard recognizes. Basically, you just want to enable that, save changes and exit, and then your RAM will be running at the rated speed that you paid for. Nothing worse than you're kind of wasting some money there if you're not taking advantage of the RAM speeds that you paid for if you're not enabling that in the BIOS, because it's not going to typically do that by itself. Going back over hardware side of things here, let's get into power supplies. This is definitely an area you can overspend on. I will say definitely don't cheap out on a good power supply. I'm a big fan of Seasonic units. I pretty much use them in most of my builds here, and I do tend to prefer modular based power supplies. So with these, what that means is every cable you need plugs into it like so. So say this is the, let's see, the PSU CPU cable here. Like I said, that will plug into it. You typically have 3 different types of power supplies on the market. You have fully modular, like this one here. These, every cable can be disconnected from the power supply itself. You'll have semi-modular, meaning typically the 24-pin to the motherboard, which is the kind of main power to the motherboard, will be connected already. The CPU PCIe connector will already be kind of connected, and you'll typically see these kind of running together out on the side of the motherboard there. And then you might even have a PCIe connection already there for, say, a graphics card, whether it be an 8-pin or an 8+6 pin or 2 8-pins that'll already be run there. And then you'll be able to plug in, say, if you need extra SATA power cables and maybe even an extra PCIe cable. And then you have, those are semi-modular, and then you have non-modular, where all the cables are already connected. You can't take any of them out. You can't add any cables to it. It pretty much is what it is. Now, there's benefits to each. Typically, fully modular power supplies tend to be a little more. But like I said, typically for these, why I like fully modular power supplies is, like I said, I choose how many cables I need. If I don't need all the extra, say, SATA cables or extra PCIe cables, if one's already enough, I don't have to worry about cramming all that into my power supply basement in my PC case. So in that instance, I don't have to worry about kind of just shoving all that in there. It's a lot easier to clean up, less clutter, and things like that. So you don't have to worry about, just trying to fit all that in there, where you just unplug what you don't need and leave that in your box. That's it. While we're going over, the benefits of fully modular cables like these, one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give you is, say, if you do have 2 of these lying around, or your friend has one or something, don't try to mix and match cables. Like I said, typically these are spec'd for the power supplies they come with, and not every PCIe cable or SATA cable that's SATA power is created equal. So like with these, typically they might have the same connector, but they might have different pinouts altogether, meaning the actual wires that come out of what plugs into that. So don't just try to mix and match them thinking they'll work. I've seen plenty of stories, and I had a friend blow one of his SATA drives up, an SSD he had, because it was the incorrect cable for that power supply. So definitely, you want to kind of keep all the cables together if you're going with fully modular like this. And then the second biggest thing on power supplies is kind of speccing to what wattage you need, or how much power the power supply actually has. And that's going to depend on the main 2 things is going to be your CPU and GPU choice. So basically, if you have a power hungry CPU and GPU, you might want to go, or you're going to want to go with a higher wattage power supply. So in this instance, say on something like this 2070 Super here and this 3600 CPU, the 3600 CPU is not a super high TDP part. Like I said, it's only a 65 watt base CPU. Of course, that's going to be a little higher under load, and maybe if I want to overclock it, we might be able to push it closer to 90 watts or so. And then, with the 2070 Super, all depending on if you overclock or not, can actually absorb some power as well. So typically, for something in that range, you might want to push for something like a 650 watt power supply, just to be safe, handle some overclocking, things of that nature. When you start moving up to, say, a 3070, a 3080, say with a 5600X, or even up to a 5950X or so, you'll want to start increasing the wattage of your power supply to be able to handle what parts you want to go with. Now, again, a power supply is definitely something I don't mind overspending on so much, because this is something that's typically going to outlast a lot of parts. Most power supplies have pretty long warranties on them. Like, most of Seasonics are going to have 7 to 10 year warranties on most of their power supplies. And there's a couple other manufacturers out there that are the same way. So it's something you can definitely carry over build to build. So even if you decide to get rid of everything, start over, build a new system, this is something you can always take with you, because warranties are really long on these guys. And so long as you bought a quality power supply, they should last you through even a couple of builds. So there's some out there that I've seen going for 10 plus years and they're still just fine. Because the standard, as far as the plugs, really hasn't changed any in motherboards in a while. So the third thing, other than just wattage and how much power your power supply outputs, is the efficiency rating. If you guys have looked around for power supplies in a bit, let me see, where this one is on here. This one is a 80 plus gold power supply. I typically recommend kind of going for an 80 plus bronze at the very lowest. Typically, I only buy 80 plus gold or higher if I can avoid it. Now, there's definitely some good units out there that are 80 plus bronze, so long as you're sticking with brands like Seasonic, EVGA, let's see, Cooler Master. There's good brands that you can get, still great power supplies out of if they're, say, 80 plus bronze, but I don't recommend going any lower than that. As far as the quality of, capacitors and everything that they use in their power supplies, I definitely want to get those higher end parts, because it's going to last me longer, and I'm not going to have to worry about it killing any of my parts that are plugged into it. All right, so now that we've gone over that, we'll go and jump into, let's say, cases. Now, like I said, the biggest mistakes you can make on a case typically is just buying the wrong size. It's definitely possible to do. So typically you want to match your case size with your motherboard size. So you want to kind of pair those two together. The second thing, the biggest thing that I typically look at when it comes to cases, I tend to prefer more open airflow cases. That's actually why I did like this DF700 Flex from Antec here. So you'd have a pretty nice open mesh front panel here. These do include 5 fans out of the box. Again, I'll link that up in the cards there if you guys want to see how this case was, how it came together, and it's a pretty good price of 75 bucks as well. But with these, you have a ton of airflow coming in here through this mesh front panel here. So definitely, if you're going to have some hot parts in your system, the last thing you want to do is choke it all off and not give it any airflow at all. You have to kind of worry about, well, will your graphics card fit? You definitely don't want to buy too small of a case and then not have enough room for your GPU to go in there. Or when it comes to air coolers, you want something, depending on what air cooler you go with, as far as compatibility with your motherboard. Again, you got it all mounted in there, it's looking nice, it's cool, the CPU just fine. You go to put it in your case and say you end up and it's too tall to fit in the case. So like I said, this one would be just fine. But say if you got a case that's maybe thinner this way and doesn't accommodate the height of your CPU cooler. So that's something you always want to check when you're shopping around. You see a case you really like, it's got some great features, it's got the I/O you want as far as the front panel connectors. It's got some great fans, lighting, whatever it may be that you're attracted with about the case. You want to make sure, do a little bit of reality checking here to make sure that your graphics card is going to fit in there just fine, and you're going to have room for it, as well as say if you're running a air cooler like this for your CPU, that you have enough height clearance for it. Now when it comes to, say, if you want to do an AIO or any kind of water cooling, you're going to need some radiator supports. Now, like I said, there's tons going back and forth about what's better and as far as mounting positions. So say if we're running a 360 AO like this deep cooling over here. So this case in particular does have 2 different spots you could mount it. So when it comes to this case in particular, it'll support a 360 rad up at the top, and it also supports a 360 rad up front. Typically, when it comes to AOs, I normally mount most of them at the top of the case, whether it be a 240 or a 360, depending on what it supports and what AO I might be using at the time. You can mount them at the front, but typically you want unrestricted airflow coming into your case. Yes, that will kind of heat up your CPU a little bit if you're Say if you have intake fans here and you have the radiator installed at the top, you might get slightly higher temps on your CPU, but typically it's going to be because you're cooling your graphics card more at that point, because especially if you have an just air-cooled card like this, you're going to be pulling in cool air from the outside, exhausting hot air here, and then exhausting air out through the top here where your AO might be mounted up top. You're going to be cooling your graphics card a little better, but it does spit out a good bit of heat itself. It's going to be going through your radiator, which, like I said, is going to raise your temps a little bit. But typically when it comes to gaming, you're more so worried about keeping your GPU cooler than your CPU at that point, because that's going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting, especially when it comes to 1440p or higher refresh rate gaming. Your CPUs, or your GPU, excuse me, is doing a lot more of the heavy lifting at that point, unless you're, say, running at low resolutions, where you might run into a CPU bottleneck situation there where you're just cranking out tons of frame rate. But typically, I kind of aim to cool my GPU down the most, especially when it comes to something like doing just gaming. But like I said, yeah, that's some of the biggest things that I will look for, say, when putting together a new build. But like I said, closing with kind of all the things we've gone over now so far, one of the biggest things that I recommend you guys doing when you first get your system set up, no matter what parts you decide to go with, is please go in and tune your fans. The worst thing you can do, especially when you have all your fans plugged into your motherboard, they are, most of them, on modern motherboards, or PWM, or pulse width modulation controlled headers there, meaning you can control them with software and by how much power is applied to that header. So when it comes to your fans here, you want to make sure you're tuning them vary to the amount of heat that is coming out of your system. There's nothing worse than, you have them cranked 100%, they're super loud, and you're sitting there on your desktop doing nothing, or looking through, email, whatever it may be. You open a Chrome tab, and eat up all your memory or something, I don't know. But you don't want to be sitting there doing nothing and you have your fans cranked to the max, being super loud. Everything's gonna be very cool, but the system's also not doing anything. So what I recommend doing, go into your BIOS. There's on most motherboard BIOSes now, there's smart fan control. You can dial a fan curve in to increase your fan speed as your system does something or your CPU goes under load, and you can do them, you can chain them to different things. So if you have, more bottom-based fans and you want them to push more air into your GPU when it does something, or you can tie it to your CPU, however you want to do it. But I definitely recommend dialing those in BIOS before you just letting them crank to the max and run at 100%. It's not really good for the fans to sit there all the time, and it would be kind of loud and annoying. As far as just general gaming, like I said, some mistakes I've seen people make is not updating drivers. That can make a big difference in gaming. Typically for Nvidia or Radeon, like I said, they're especially with newer GPUs, game drivers are constantly updating, and it can be kind of annoying to have to stop and wait and install one. But especially if you're dealing with any kind of bug or underutilization in games, drivers can definitely help, and that goes for more than just your GPU. I definitely want to check to make sure you update your chipset drivers when it comes to your motherboard. The actual, what's handling all the I/O typically on most motherboards. Like I said, so long as your BIOS is compatible with the CPU, chipset drivers do roll out a pretty good bit. So if they fix a problem or issue, one of the biggest ones that plagued AMD recently was USB front panel or USB header disconnects. I never experienced it myself, but I did see a lot of people complaining about it. But they've patched that in a recent update or BIOS update. But I'll definitely check back with your motherboard manufacturer. I don't recommend flashing BIOS all the time if you're not having issues, but definitely check their patch notes and see, what fixes might have come out. They do typically come out with if it's a problem fix or bug fix, or if it's just a better memory optimization or better memory compatibility. Say it wasn't compatible with one kit, and now it is. They've added that kit to the motherboard BIOS there. So definitely check your manufacturer site from time to time and kind of look through their updates for chipset drivers and BIOSes and things of that nature, just to see if they have something in the patch notes that's like, oh, I've been experiencing this problem. They have a fix for it now. It's definitely good to stay on top of that as well. And then when it comes to everything else, such as your networking, your LAN ports or Wi-Fi, whatever it may be, whatever board you might have, you can definitely get them handy to check to make sure to see if those have any updates, if you're experiencing any problems with those as well. But I think that pretty much covers everything I want to talk about today. I know that was not a comprehensive list, but just a kind of short list of some things that when it comes to picking out different parts. Like I said, there's no way I can cover every possible thing because there's so many different options when it comes to PC building. That's what makes this so fun. Other than the graphics card shortage right now, is you can choose what kind of PC you want. Everyone can be a little different. Not everyone has to look the same or act the same or perform the same, and you kind of build something to your own use case. And that's always what I recommend when it comes to building PCs in the space and newer builders is, you have to kind of decide what you need it to do or what you want it to do. And then kind of go from there as far as building your budget out and then what you need to do with it from there. Like I said, if you guys do have any other questions about anything we talked about today, definitely drop a comment down below. Or, like I said, this wasn't a comprehensive list and I couldn't possibly cover everything. So definitely leave your advice in the comments down below to newer builders as well of what other things you might recommend as far as picking out parts, making sure things are compatible, or anything I missed in this video. And then let me know if you would like me to touch on any of these individual topics in another video coming up. Like I said, so we have some updates we've been working on as far as what's going on Instagram. Like I said, I've been dealing, I don't know if you can hear me, but I've been dealing with a little cold myself for a little bit, kind of getting over some flu. Luckily, not COVID or anything like that, but that's had me down for a little bit. But I wanted to get back into making some stuff today and hopefully being able to shoot some more content and everything for the YouTube for you guys. And of course, over on Instagram at Desktops Gaming, definitely check us out over there as well. Because the algorithm hasn't been kind to us on either platform, especially when I've been, kind of sick and not able to keep up with posting and things like that. But like I said, I'm not going to make any excuses, but I would definitely appreciate you guys' support if you want to check out the Instagram or, give us a like here or subscribe here to see more content coming. Like I said, we did a video about 2 weeks ago on this guy. Like I said, we'll probably put that in the end card as well. So if you guys want to see any more on that, definitely check that video out. But again, I appreciate you guys for stopping by. Drop a comment down below if you are want to add to this conversation as far as what you would recommend newer builders to go with. But again, appreciate you guys for stopping by. Take it easy.